righty, top of the hour. Cool. So welcome everyone. So my name is Kyle Bird with the Uncertainty Project. So what we're doing with the Uncertainty Project is building and curating just a library of models and techniques around strategic decision making, particularly group decision making, and really just exploring tools for navigating uncertainty. And so when it comes to making hard decisions, trade-offs, and what to invest in as an organization are some of the hardest. So excited for today. We're going to be talking about dealing with uncertainty in portfolio management. So to introduce our guests, both of which do a lot of work with the Uncertainty Project. You'll see a lot of tools and techniques that they've authored out there. But first off, we have John May. So John is really considered an expert in lean portfolio management. At Atlassian, he was instrumental in architecting the Portfolio Management Playbook. And in particular, he worked with some of Atlassian's largest customers who were transforming their own portfolio management practices. So these include Fortune 500, Fortune 2000 companies, finance, telecoms, consumer products, insurance, tech, you name it. And then we have Chris Butler. So Chris is a lead product manager at Google's machine learning group. Chris has actually a few really incredible talks on strategy and how product organizations decide how to decide. And we'll actually we'll link some of those. We send out the recording and the show notes. But he's also just very thoughtful about how product portfolios operate and kind of make effective trade-offs and navigate uncertainty. So huge thanks for both of you for being here. And some really quick right before we get into it. So this is being recorded. We'll make it available afterwards, probably around Monday or so. But if you do have a question, we are obviously live if you dropped into the middle of our conversation. So go ahead and drop any questions you have in the chat. We'll go ahead and address those at the end. We'll leave some time. I also have some from people messaging me earlier, so we could get into those as well. Cool. So between the two of y'all, it feels like we have a kind of a full spectrum of what we might think of as kind of even more traditional PPM or kind of transforming organizations, as well as kind of like the true product-led organization. If we can just start with definitions, and Chris, maybe we'll start with you. What is portfolio management? How do you define portfolio management?
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever we start to think about how a product manager is doing their job, they tend to focus usually on one product or one part of a product. But at a certain level of seniority, you start to think about multiple products that may exist within your organization. Like a group product manager, for example, would probably think about not just one product, but maybe like an ecosystem of products or a set of products that are sold together or are in some way like connected within that organization. And so to me, portfolio management ends up being that we're no longer making decisions at the level of like what features, what epics, what kind of bugs are we dealing with? And we're taking a frame that ends up being much larger. And I think usually you don't really get to that point of portfolio management until you have more than just one product. And you need to then not only take an understanding of like, what are we trying to build or what problems we're trying to solve, not just within a product, but across all these products. But also then this idea of like, how does headcount get allocated across different features or functionalities or even products themselves? And then finally, I think the traditional sense of portfolio management is really this idea of, from a financial sense, how are you balancing some kind of set of, say, securities or something like that? And that's where this 80-20 rule comes from, of like things that you want to make sure you're like invested in that are just like stable, and then there's 20% which ends up being very focused on like growth or some other type of like high yield but higher risk type of thing. And so I think taking that type of definition also is really important, is that we're not just here to kind of say which is most, importance is very, very valuable to understand between different products, but also how are you now trying to become not only just like resilient or robust inside of like an uncertain future, but actually thriving there. And so by putting people and resources on projects that are very early stage, and balancing that. So hedging in some way across all your projects, I think, is another key component of portfolio management. And so we talk about all these things, but I think that's kind of my definition at a very basic level. It's more than one product. Usually it's across a larger part of the group. It can also get bigger and bigger when you start talking about like how far up in a hierarchy you are. So like Google, right, has a lot of very big product areas that also manage a portfolio. Like in our case for core machine learning, we have tens of products that are part of our portfolio. And so when working with teams, we're trying to figure out like, how do we invest in these different things to be able to prepare for like an uncertain future?
Got it. John, how about you?
Yeah, my background comes from enterprises. So what's really challenging about portfolio is that you'll find it at multiple levels of a company. So climb all the way to the C-suite, and people are talking about a portfolio of businesses, right? I've got, if you're familiar with like the Horizon concept, I've got Horizon 1, 2, 3. And, I think it's always about moving money around. You're actually fueling what's going on at whatever level you're working with. So that's a common denominator. And then you're trying to, set the table with those choices around money so that good things can happen. And I think whether you're talking about a portfolio of businesses clear up at the top, or even within a product, Chris, I would guess there's all kinds of questions of balancing and optimization that a product leader is going through. But then I think that midpoint that you hit on, that's where you tend to see the word most often, and that could be like inside of a business unit, that could be inside of some line business. But yes, multiple products at play, usually competing for that money that you're pushing around. And that healthy competition of what's the pie chart going to look like. The only other thing I'll add, I think most of the times too, when I'm seeing portfolio, it's about choices more about how you're going to change the business. And I think we're going to get into a little bit about how strategy influences what goes on here. But a lot of times these are the initiatives about how do I set the table with some money so that I can get the changes I need. So that's why it's so loaded, right? The choices we're making, the pie charts we're building are how we're going to go shape our future. In terms of where I'm going to put the money or make the money available, I guess. Not a lot of details, hopefully, but that idea of, I have a vision of where I want to go, and this is what the pie chart needs to look like to start getting us there. It's that change thing that sometimes gets buried, honestly. And I think that's where, whether you're talking about, a pie chart that shows product A, product B, and product C, or something lower level that says change initiative A, B, and C, or clear at the top to say, business A, B, and C. I think that's the universal as I see it.
What's the and maybe this plays into just kind of like the definition of a portfolio, and maybe it's different based on that, but like what is in those definitions, like what is success to a portfolio? Like how would you be able to kind of like gauge if a portfolio is like successfully navigating levels of uncertainty? Like what does that look like? Maybe it's an obvious question, like if it's just like purely ROI or capital efficiency, but like what is success for a portfolio?
You want to take that one, Chris, or you want me to start? Yeah, well, I think it's this middle role, right? I think we're going to get into a little more detail about how this does help you connect some strategic vision that's taken place all the way down to the execution that's happening across all the teams. So a successful portfolio is the one that can successfully move the money around, set those balances correctly so that, as that starts to fuel what's happening in the teams, which are hopefully operating fairly independently, that, the right amount of fuel is in the right places so the strategy comes to life. And it's that connecting role, I think, that would define success.
Yeah, and I would maybe add to that we're making the appropriate trade-offs between things is really important, because I think inside of a portfolio, I think a lot of people try to get to some type of stack ranking of all the different things, and it's not the sense of like this team is valuable and this team is not, but it's more like where are we going to put time and energy and resources into these projects. And even just the idea, like we already referenced kind of McKinsey's 3 Horizon, which I don't know if we're allowed to talk about without giving them like paid royalties or hiring a consultant or something like that. But also just even something as simple as like the Eisenhower matrix, when you talk about like urgency versus importance, like you start to create this breakdown of like what things are actually truly urgent and what is that defined as, right? And how should you be reacting to those things inside your portfolio? And so, the thing that ends up being urgent, and this was from like an engineering director that I'm part of, is like, what are the things that are really going to get us yelled at? Those things are probably urgent, right? Things that are important end up being like in alignment with our, strategy, OKRs, any of those things that we end up using to kind of like help prioritize. And so you almost don't want to be in that. Like if you think about Eisenhower as having kind of 4 quadrants, we actually have like we talked a lot about that. Even in the like far upper right hand corner of urgent and important, for example, that's like the tier 1 quintile. And what ends up being in there are things like you don't want to be in that quintile, because that means that you will be giving a presentation every week to the VPs about your project. What you want to be is probably like quintile 2, where you're like, it's urgent and important, but it's not like this is something that is like everybody wants to know about. But and so that's why I also think like when we talk about multiple projects or teams, we may end up actually prioritizing between projects that are across different products, right? And so there may be things that are kind of broken out by that, and it depends on, again, the team and the hierarchy and the type of work that ends up going into that. And then, finally, it's not that there's no important work, right? Like there's no such thing as like unimportant work, because it wouldn't be on our priority list if it was unimportant. And so I think that ends up being another thing, is like resetting this expectation with teams that if you're lower in the quintiles, so to speak, of this stuff, like it doesn't mean that your project is unimportant or your team is unimportant. It just means that for whatever reason, these things based on like importance and urgency within the organization, they're just lower. And so that means that you may get less staffing, but it doesn't mean we will not staff it, right? And actually we were joking that the 6th quintile is actually where you will not have staffing because you're like off of the actual stack ranking, and that's where the line is drawn. But usually, it's very rare, other than teams that plan way too far ahead, right? Where they have like a 5-year roadmap with like a humongous backlog and icebox and everything. They end up thinking about like, there's this line that is like here, but there's like all this stuff in the future still. I think a lot of teams end up just saying like, here's the most important projects that we're working on because they're staffed. And so I think there's like kind of something about that idea of it's not just about the idea that you're above the line, but it's like there's like almost like a spectrum of kind of how much attention is being given to it versus how much and the amount of like resourcing. And then from there you end up kind of like figuring out how to adjust what you would do based on that. And so that's why it ends up being also kind of like an alignment activity a lot of the time. And that if something needs to move up, something needs to move down. And that is another conversation that is incredibly important for teams to have. And if they don't have a way to like talk about that stuff together, it ends up just being a lot of fighting about like, well, I want this and I want this. But the reality is like, we should be creating shared queues, which is something, I think a lot of teams don't, if they don't have a shared queue that is visible, a lot of the time they end up having a lot of problems where PMs look like gatekeepers that are just saying no to things, when the reality is it's like, this is a trade-off discussion, not a yes or no discussion. So I think that's another thing about that.
Yeah, the portfolio conversations tend to get to the trade-offs quick because it's a finite amount of money that you're pushing around, right? But you asked about success, Kyle. I think another key thing, and I would say this is probably the biggest challenge of portfolio management today, is the ability to get off the status quo. So we talk a lot about biases within the uncertainty project, and uncertainty and the status quo bias is a good one, and there's others that are related to that. But one of the things we tend to see is your point about how they're all teams are valuable, true, but to nudge and start having those teams focus on new things. That's a big part of what portfolio leaders are trying to affect. And it's super challenging, right? That, this is what we did last year. Therefore, we're probably going to do that again next year. You hear a lot in strategy circles about asymmetric bets, right? This is where we have to deliberately start to tilt things toward the future we want. And portfolio managers have a real hard time, and it's not their fault, right? It's these biases all coming into play. So to provide, enough support, environment, architecture around the decision making they're doing to help them overcome this, it's a tremendous challenge. And simple stack ranking, I saw a lot of that, and that's not enough. I mean, we've seen people come in and try to do that, but it's part of the story, but it's certainly not the whole story.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe I was just going to add too that I think this idea of kind of the success is not just necessarily the success of the team, but it's about the ability of the team to continue on, right, in some way. And so John Boyd has talked about the idea of that strategy is, in general, it has a lot to do with this idea that we are allowed to continue on our own terms is basically what we need to be doing. And so if you run out of money or the company gets shut down or something like that, you no longer have optionality. And so I think the bets that we end up making inside of portfolio management And a successful bet is one where we spend as little as possible on things that are very uncertain, but that grow those things in the share of the pie, so to speak, as we become more and more certain that they're a good thing to focus on. And that's where we gain evidence, not only by like being in the market, right? Like, is this being taken up? Does it have product market fit based on some metric or something like that? But also just this idea of like, are we gaining more and more evidence of different types of evidence that we've bet on something that's valuable?
Yeah, that's super important. And that's the trick. I think portfolio managers are there. They're interpreting the strategy. Hopefully that's been given. Some of those great trade-off decisions of, we're seeking this over that. Chris, you talked about some even overstatements, right? Those are great examples of how to express trade-off decisions out on the uncertainty project. And then I think the challenge is not so much to be, telling the teams what to do or building plans for them. That's still a legacy behavior we're trying to shake, I think, in a lot of portfolio leaders' realms. But it's by helping communicate those, even over decisions around strategic trade-offs, and then making sure that as the leaders in those decentralized teams, decentralized decision-making is taking place, they're responding and reacting and setting direction based on that strategy. But do they have enough runway to go pursue it? I think it's, the portfolio managers are moving money to make sure that the answer to that is yes. And that's the idea that, if you're seeking some changes in some areas, we'd love for those teams to make those decisions on how to get there. But the fuel, the money has to be there as well. Simple example being maybe the team needs to grow, or maybe one team is not enough, or maybe we need to start shaking it up and bringing some new people in.
In the scenario that, so you think about, a scenario that many are probably in, where you kind of have these, this like stack ranking from hell. It sounds great to be able to go focus on a few more like experimental big bets, high uncertainty, right? But realistically, what ends up happening is we get a list of things to do. There's a ton of just, the status quo, the things that have just always been going. And so it's much easier to go invest in those things. Especially in today's environment, it's only harder to go invest in more uncertain bets. Like, what's the, kind of how do you get out of that? We're basically doing, rice scoring or some kind of methodology to kind of just agree on some kind of score in order to prioritize things. Like what's the step to kind of take on a bit more uncertainty, a bit more like ambiguity in the portfolio?
I mean, one thing I think is helpful, or at least when dealing with kind of the ambiguity or uncertain, like ambiguity in what is the right thing to do next, is we did an exercise with one team that, is like hundreds of engineers and a portfolio that they're dealing with for that team. And we would take them through different types of prioritization methodologies, essentially. And because it started to help them build or figure out kind of what is actually the strategy that they're based on. What are these even overs? And so I think a lot of teams, they end up starting with like comprehensiveness, right? Here's everything we're doing. And we have kind of funded things in such a way previously that didn't really have any great rules, or at least the rules were not as transparent as they could have been. And so once you start to then try on these different ways of like prioritizing, you can back into things like even overstatements or other types of decision models that could be very valuable for people. And so I think that's maybe the thing that I think is really important, is that we should be trying out these types of things, because that allows us to then kind of build out scenarios that like, is this mix appropriate for this future that we believe is going to happen? That can lead you to things like scenario planning. Same thing with like strategic rehearsal or decision rehearsal. This idea of like wargaming out the type of thing that you're trying to work on. I think that helps you actually harness or not harness, but like grapple with this like uncertainty that will be there. But it allows you to start to say, like, based on the shape that we think the future is going to happen, what types of things will maybe work or won't work. And if we try something out that doesn't seem to work inside of this like gaming, maybe it's a bad decision then, right? Or maybe it's a decision that we should rethink in some way.
Can you talk a bit, just really quick, sorry, Chris, can you just dig into even overstatements? I know we've mentioned it a few times, but just to kind of give the
Sure.
overview of what an overstatement is.
Yeah, even over is something I first learned from the founder of Parable, like a long time ago. But it's basically where you're saying that you want, inside of strategy or strategic thinking in general, it's usually about trying to make hard decisions easier for people. And you're going to like this even over that is the format of the statement, but it means that like within the statement, there are two different things we could choose. And ideally, those two different things are both great things that could make a lot of sense for you to choose within your organization. But maybe there's some controversy, or there's something where you have to land on one or the other because of the fact that that will, at least you believe that that will make it better from a strategic standpoint in the future. And so the best example of that is like Agile. The Agile Manifesto has a list of these things like people over process, right? And it's not necessarily that we'll never depend on process, but it's that usually we should be choosing people over process in this particular case. And so this is something that I really advocate for a lot of people, especially when they're writing out like their strategic document for their organization or group or whatever, having a couple of these things where here are trade-offs that we are making essentially. And they should be actually the controversies within the team usually, because if it's just like a good idea, like you should, yes, of course you should make that decision. And this gets to like, Richard Rummel's idea of like fluff in Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, where, if you're being the best at something is not a trade-off, right? Like you either are or you aren't. You can't choose to be the best. You can choose to do a lot of things that make you the best. But what's interesting to me is like, what would and I call this bizarro strategy, but it's like, what would actually another, like say a parallel world of your organization that made all of the opposite choices inside of the strategy, that should also be a potentially successful strategy. And so that's why these even overstatements are so interesting, is because it should be really like, what are the core kind of almost controversial types of statements that we want to make it clear, like very clear for the team that we will choose these things over these things. And I think that gets you into this realm of like better strategic decision making. And so anyways, even overstatements are a great way to do that. And I've used those a lot. I would just say, one of the things I've started to notice as we've been using these and kind of like ongoing with them is some of them will be aspirational. Like ideally, when we talk about principles, right, it should be things that we have constantly chosen as an organization that is part of our culture. Even overstatements, though, I think they end up being kind of a mix of how we should show examples of when we've made these types of decisions. But we should also be very upfront if one of these even overstatements is incredibly aspirational. Like we've never made decisions this way before, but we should start doing this, I think is a really important thing to enact on, because if you just have a list of only aspirational even overstatements and you check in a quarter and no one has made any decisions like that, and especially in like portfolio management, if you keep on making decisions that are not in line with your strategy, that means that either your strategy is wrong or your portfolio management process is wrong. And it's going to be one of those two. And it's okay that it's one of them. It's just that we need to now either put our money where our mouth is, which is the portfolio side, or we need to change what our strategy is, which is the other one. So that's what I would just add about even overstatements.
Do you see a difference there when you say, kind of the put your money where your mouth is portfolio side and more of the strategic side? Like is there kind of a clear difference between like what is strategic and what is portfolio management? Is that blurred? Like what does that look like to y'all?
I mean, there shouldn't be, but I'll let John answer, but I would just say, I don't think there should be. They should be in alignment.
Yeah. I mean, you're seeking alignment, but I think this is where, sometimes the ability to get off the status quo, right? We all know the challenges of killing active projects, right? And I think in a perfect world, you could come in, wipe the slate clean and talk about what you need for the next year, but we know the world's not that simple. So, I think at the end of the day, I mentioned asymmetric bets. I think to truly move large organizations, it's going to take some acts of will. And I think with portfolio management, you have the ability to shift money around, and I'm talking big money too. Like most of the times, if you're settling in at that middle level of a large Fortune 100 company, the things you're considering doing, these elements you're stack ranking, the choices you're making that are forming these pie charts, these are $1 million, $5 million, $10 million choices on moving the money toward this this need for change. So it could be one team for a year. It could be a fraction of a handful of teams over the course of a year. But these are significant investments. Not everything goes through this, and to that end, you have the ability to shape the future with it. And that's the opportunity to align with strategy. That's essential. It has to happen.
When it comes and John, maybe we'll start with you. Like, and especially within kind of portfolio management, especially when we talk about uncertainty versus something like risk or managing dependencies. Like, what's the difference between uncertainty and risk? Is there a difference? Do we think those are synonymous?
You're asking about uncertainty. I think I would set the bar pretty low. I think if in a portfolio conversation, you can just acknowledge uncertainty, talk about the unknowns, you're already moving in the right direction. Because think about it, like if you're in a world where you're supposed to stack rank everything, the implication is I've got enough certainty on this to know whether this should be slotted at number 8 or number 9 on my stack rank list. Think about that for a second. The reality is we don't know. There's tremendous uncertainty on all these things we could go put money against, and just opening the door and to that mindset, I think, is a tremendous step. Now, how to do that, I think that's a lot of what we're talking about in the Uncertainty Project, is what are the new approaches, tools, mindsets that help us do that. But I think it's also good to reflect back and say, where are some of the tools that were put together with all great intent, but they may be kind of hampering us from starting to understand these uncertain worlds we live in.
And the whole thing about uncertainty versus risk is a really interesting one. I'm actually part of a meetup group where Von Tan, who wrote The Uncertainty Mindset, really great book just about kind of how to build teams that really focus on innovation through the lens of super high-end restaurants that do R&D. And so, like, these test kitchens that they have off to the side that are constantly just exploring the space of food and technique and process, how they actually set up their teams for success in those types of environments is really interesting. But his next project is actually around what he'll just refer to as not knowing. And the truth is like everything we're talking about when we talk about like ambiguity, uncertainty, risk, there are kind of both economic, like kind of versions of or definitions of those things. But when we talk about like risk or uncertainty, we're actually talking about like just not knowing something is literally what it is. And it's colloquially, it's used in all these different ways. You just did a post that we can share later, but about like these different kind of like Knightian uncertainty and risk versus like other types of uncertainty. And the colloquial version, it's like a very weird kind of Venn diagram of like where different types of risks and uncertainties actually exist. And so I think to your point about this too, about like stack ranking, is that we're, especially with things like say rice prioritization, right? We're actually adding a level of precision that is probably not there. And I think you're right about the truth about stack ranking is that it is not actually always exactly just this like very tight like list of things. There's probably gaps, there's probably overlaps. But I think this is why we do things like, say, planning poker, right? Planning poker is more about the disagreement between two different types of complexity estimates than it is to actually use that estimate that then locks people into like a particular set of days that they're then held against. And this is why like sharing velocity between teams is such a bad idea, basically. But like, I think one of the things that is really valuable about this type of thing is how do you start to cause those arguments around this thing is above this thing or not, right? And I think that's super valuable to me. But I do want to like make it very clear that yeah, risk versus uncertainty is a really, I think we just need to say that like, we don't know how the future is going to play out. We have signals that we can start to observe. There are techniques like Tripwires, which are basically like when something happens as a signal, we have to reassess our assumptions, right? And that's really valuable from a strategic standpoint. But I think that's kind of like, I don't know if it's worthwhile. We should just say what we mean by risk and uncertainty probably, rather than like worry about defining it. It's like strategy and vision and mission and principles and values. All those things are just like, we should just declare bankruptcy on all those terms, and we just have to redefine them. That's the thing, what we mean when we're talking about it.
Well, that's a great point, because there's so much written on that. You can get lost. You get in wormholes pretty quick. I think if you put me on the spot, Chris, and said, what's your working definition right now? I think I've come to like associate risk way more with like, I've got a plan. I've made some commitments. Now I need to basically identify, understand, manage, mitigate risks. Because I have made some decisions. I'm plotting something and it's underway. Now this is my responsibility, my obligation. Whereas uncertainty is more in that front end we were talking about, like, let's acknowledge there is uncertainty, step one. And then as we talk about it, coming back to your planning poker and some sort of a stack ranking mechanism, we all know that the whole point is to drive that conversation, right? It's like those are tools to help you have conversations around uncertainty, or at least disagreements and across your team. But that gets lost so often. And I think that's another good reminder is, it's not necessarily about whether it's slotted number 8 or number 9. It's about what did you surface as you had a conversation around whether it should be number 8 or number 9. And that tends to get lost sometimes. And that's a good reminder that it's okay to say, I don't know if it should be 8 or it should be 9. That's just as critical.
Well, I would also say that I think there's different team members or cross-functional like when we talk about a cross-functional team, there's different groups that are going to prioritize different things. Because I think another set of definitions that I've used a lot is like risk is really about known things that we have a possibility of happening or have happened in the past. And so to me, the idea of risk reduction is more of like the PMO's realm. Where they're trying to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again, that we don't miss kind of important aspects of things that we can understand. Versus, I think when we talk about like product management, right, we're trying to actually optimize or embrace or or like thrive and take advantage of the uncertainties that are there. And so if everybody knew what was the right thing to build for this like problem, right, then everybody would be doing it. And so from that perspective, that's why like product management ends up, in my opinion, being a lot about like abductive thinking, where we have some amount of evidence that is there, but then we have to make an imaginative leap towards something new that hasn't been done yet. And I've been diving down into this thing called like assembly theory, which is really about how do we understand like the markers of life on other planets based on complex molecules. And I think there's something very interesting and weird about like, what does that look like, but for like process within a team? Like, what are the molecules that you have to have before you can get to this next thing? And so that's where I think like we want to continue to build better muscles in having these conversations so that they're just naturally happening. But we sometimes have to force it based on some of these mechanisms that we'll end up using. And so, yeah, I think that's important to me, is this difference between risk versus uncertainty. If we're going to use that type of terminology, is that we want to reduce risk as much as possible, but not to stop the embracing of uncertainty. And that's why I think of it as a spectrum between, usually PM, project managers and product managers. I see it as like a tug of war a little bit, and there's healthy tension that is there. And that in some cases, you're going to be more on the de-risk side, where maybe it's a highly regulated industry. There's lots of compliance that you have to adhere to, versus like a startup that is just getting started. That idea of like trying a bunch of the crazy stuff first is probably much better for your portfolio. And so anyways, I think there's something interesting about that kind of definitional difference too.
Yeah, and I think another definitional difference on risk that's worth surfacing is I think the history of risk management, again, in these large enterprises I'm used to working with, is more about execution risk, right? I've got a project, I've got people managing that. Let's make sure that I have a handle on the execution risk. But clearly, like strategy risk, which is much more about the outside world and your sense making around it. That tends to play in much more often to a strategy and even a portfolio leadership realm. I'd like to shift all this money into this corner. Let's talk about the risks behind some of the decisions that got us here, and be able to have a tripwire, to your early point, so that, hey, if I sense that this is not the truth anymore, then I'm willing to come back and revisit where that money really belongs at that point. But I think so much of us have grown up in worlds where it's about managing risk to execution, which, let's be honest, we've gotten a lot better at execution in the last 20 years, right? And we've also taken very large things that require very active risk management and made them smaller things. And that means we get to outputs and outcomes a lot faster. So less need to have an army of people watching, tracking, communicating risk. So that's a good thing. But now I think that same ability to communicate about risk would be much better suited to handling this crazy world outside our walls.
Yeah, and I love the point about at least this idea of like tripwires. The reason why it's so interesting to me is because I think there's usually a whole set of assumptions that are underpinning the way we have actually set up our portfolios and the way we think our portfolio will unfold over time, right? And so that idea of, well, first of all, it's very hard to actually get at all of the assumptions. It's like asking someone like, just tell me all your assumptions, and you'll give like a few, but the reality is it's like very hard to dive into that stuff. And so I've been thinking about like David J. Bland's mechanism for like assumption mapping, which is trying to get assumptions from the entire organization, understand which of these things are actually have evidence towards them, which ones we need more evidence. Like we need to be able to set up sensor networks to be able to detect that this assumption is changing in some way. But I think this also leads to like dominant logic theory, which is something I really love thinking about, which is as senior leaders, right? Like people start to basically calcify the way they make decisions based on their past experiences. But the problem is that the world context keeps changing. And so you may make decisions that are based on past assumptions that you are not aware of in some way, right? It's kind of like it's like the idea of like blind spot bias. You don't know that you're making decisions in these ways necessarily. And so one of the things that I've used as a technique to get at some of those assumptions are actually asking about bad ideas. And so like, what is a bad way for us to organize our portfolio right now, if we were to do that? And so I think what it does is it starts to take a very messy kind of multi-dimensional space where it's like all these different things that I'm probably like stacking inside my brain to make a good decision, quote unquote, and start thinking about what those bad ones are. And so I think like that type of experimentation or exploration is really interesting. I mean, that's definitely, I believe in adding a bit of chaos into these types of things, as you probably know.
Well, that brings to mind, I can't remember the source, but I read, yet another example of a portfolio is venture capital, right? Where you got more of a venture model. And I think somebody out on Sand Hill Road actually had an anti-portfolio as one of the approaches they took. And it was that same idea of, let's imagine the absolute worst thing that we could possibly go invest in. And I bet the conversation will yield some good insights. So, for sure.
That's I love that idea.
Is your anti-portfolio for a VC firm, yeah.
Well, isn't that like basically like, especially if there's someone that is constantly like you feel like is making bad decisions, it just means that like you just take the opposite of their decision set essentially. And so there's like what's the guy that like
they call a Seinfeld episode, yeah.
Yeah, well, so that's where Bizarro actually comes from, is when like the Seinfeld characters meet their doppelgangers. It also comes from like Superman and all that type of stuff. But I think the opposite, or like looking at those types of things, help you understand better your shape of this. And I think what it gets at also is, I'd love to talk a bit about like how often do you actually look at these types of portfolios, right? And how often do you adjust them? Because I think there is I've started to use the terminology like Chronos versus Kairos time, right? Which Chronos is like calendar dates where it's like every month or quarter we look at this again and we decide, we say, is this still the right thing to do or not, right? And that's usually like OKRs, portfolios, all those things. Strategy planning ends up following those types of cadences. But then there's like Kairos, which is more of this like narrative time based on events. And so, I was working at Facebook Reality Labs on the Portal device, which is a video calling device, when the pandemic hit. And so at that point, like, we had to reassess all of the different things that we were currently prioritizing, because we realized that some of the things would be more important for us to do. Like, how do you connect when you can't be in the same place with someone was going to get more and more important. But then certain other things were going to maybe be less important in some way. And so realizing those times, and I think it gets to when our assumptions have suddenly changed because of an event, or something, an event will affect our ability to use the assumptions we had previously. I think that ends up being this time where you need to now like call a meeting and say, hey, how do we now adjust what we've been doing previously? And again, tripwires, I think, are a great technique to like decide that automatically something happens like that. Like, you automatically should have a meeting based on this tripwire. But I think that's another just like good discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts, John, on like how often do you do this, when do you decide?
Yeah, I think your point about how people can calcify in their decision making, it's so true. And I think part of what this feels like is we're just starting to make some things that have historically been invisible much more visible, whether it's assumptions or beliefs. But those underpinnings, the things that, we call it gut, we call it intuition, but there are key insights and things driving that, but they're largely invisible. And, for organizations to improve their capabilities on all this stuff, I think we're witnessing a shift there. And I think it starts with the ability to talk about it. But then also, I think the ability to start, using that to drive things like tripwires. Tripwires have to be tripping something, right? And usually that's some assumption or belief I've got. And we're not there yet. So that's a great starting point. And then with that, just the discussion around that starts to yield a readiness for when those game-changing world events occur, like your example. You're so much more prepared for, shifting your concept of time. Oh, we thought we had, some decent plans in place for the next 6 months. Guess what? We don't anymore. And I can fall back on these 4 beliefs that just evaporated overnight.
With time, obviously, like time and cadence being really important. Is there like a lot of those things, we're working like within the constraints of, the vast majority of organizations are working on, some kind of, budget cycle, right? Yearly, or kind of like updating quarterly. Like, does a lot of that have to change? Like, how I'm sitting in an organization, how we budget, how we fund has, implications on what the portfolio looks like. Like how does that have to change?
It's really hard to make universal statements on that. I think it's a function of what you're doing, right, as a business, and to some extent, it's probably a function of your size. I'd love to say it's as simple as this or that, but if you're a startup, obviously you're going to have a much different answer than if you're a legacy business that's been more or less doing the same thing for 10 years. And even within large companies, you got good little venture motions all taking place where they need to adopt that kind of same startup mentality of, what's happening this week, what's happening this month, and sense making around it. So it's, I don't know, Chris, what do you think? You're closer to, I think, a lot of that these days.
I mean, I think the model that I like to use, or one of them that I think about, is the kind of uncertainty of the project itself. I think there's an inverse proportion between usually the amount that you should be giving as far as resources, but also how much you need to check in on it. Because, like, for example, if we use like Kempbeck's 3X model is about this idea on an S curve. There's like explore, expand, and exploit. And so just looking at your projects on that type of scale is really interesting, because I think usually people think they're kind of in this, like 70% of their stuff is going to be on this like hockey stick, and then it's like 20 and 10 is kind of what I've usually heard people say. But there are plenty of teams I've worked with where it's actually more like a third, because they are doing a lot of experimentation, but they're not funding or checking in with them like experiments. They're actually funding them like full teams, and they're over betting on things that are potentially not proven yet. But they're also not checking in with them enough to be able to understand how they're adjusting towards the right type of thing, right? And so I think that is one thing that is interesting to think about. Again, it doesn't work for every single team, like you say, but I think there is, like, the more certain you are about something, probably the more you can put towards it, because you know what the ROI will be, but you also need to check in on it less, because it's probably going to be less impacted by lots of like changes, because you know kind of how it works. And so I think there's something related there. I wouldn't say it's like a hard and fast rule, but it's a good kind of rule of hand, I think, or a heuristic to at least try to understand. Like, you want to, anything that's in that explore space, you want to be checking in on a very frequent basis. And if you're not seeing change in a frequent basis, then you're doing the project wrong, probably. And vice versa, if you're up in this like exploit domain or realm, like, it can be like, if you're still just doing lots of small stuff, then it's not worthwhile, because you want to get big ROI off of those types of projects. So I think that would be an important kind of interesting relationship.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a trend too, where people are starting to recognize that instead of having a big old project plan come through and that's what gets funded and that shows up in your portfolio, so to speak. It's much more now a matter of like maybe funding some outcomes, right? Here's what I need. Here's the change I need to see. Where you're saying I'm going to put a lot of money behind this effort to get this change to happen, but now you're leaving it up to the teams to figure out how you get there. But to your point, let's oversimplify and say there's two ways that might play out. In one case, the team comes back and says, "Got it. We've been doing this for years. You couldn't give us an easier assignment. Let's go." And then they're putting that money to use immediately. And the frequency you got to check in, maybe not so much. But if there's a long conversation about that explorer stage you're talking about, and that's what a lot of us are facing right now, then that need to check back in to say, let's make it small bets. Let's make it short increments. Let's have conversations around this, since the uncertainty is so high. It's a two-way street too, right? You're putting a lot of money against something you don't know much about by definition. So therefore, as you're buying information with that funding, you're moving toward them. You want them to come back more frequently, so you can reassess your choice in the first place.
And I think this is interesting, because like the way that teams end up working together as not necessarily just like hierarchies, but also just as like a network of teams, where the management team is a team in itself that is networking with a bunch of other teams that are maybe closer to the customer. There is definitely, I think, a need for finding some mutual way to set these types of goals. So if we talk about something like OKRs, a lot of the time, well, first of all, I think like a lot of people do OKRs wrong, and maybe it means that it's not a valuable framework anymore. I don't know. I still try to do them right, but like the difference between, say, objectives and KRs, right? Like this idea of the objective is kind of, where's this thing? What is this like aspirational end state for a customer that we want to get them to, right? Like that's my really brief definition of that. And inside of that, though, there are going to be progress indicators, which are the KRs. And I think that that split between leaders helping set what the objective is and the teams that have to execute and have autonomy and agency setting the KRs, I think ends up having, again, another good discussion between those two groups, where if you set, if the team sets a bunch of different KRs, that the management team then says, actually, this is not how I imagine success, right? Or progress towards this goal. That means that we need to talk about, like, what is the difference in understanding between this objective and what we think we can do as a team exactly. And so, again, I see these things as like almost like APIs between different types of teams. And of course, like, the idea of initiatives is another great thing, that like, we definitely don't want leaders deciding what initiatives are happening inside the teams, because that should be the team's decision. And so I think it ends up, you know, like I try to make sure that my VP does not have access to any of the task lists of the teams that are working inside of our team. We don't want that, right? Like we want them staying away from that type of thing, but we want them to be able to say very large, strategically, here's where we're going. Here's the really big objectives for the next quarter. And then I need your help in figuring out how do we measure success across all the different teams for that.
Yeah, and piecing this together too, you know, to your point about execution on OKRs can really vary. I think if we kind of park what you said is that's kind of a quarterly muscle that we're flexing right there. You know, I think portfolio management is kind of what's happening upstream of that, if you will. And it's saying, look, I'm going to put $5 million into this slice of pie over here, or maybe there's a handful of $5 million chunks in this slice of pie. And it's carving out the fuel, the runway, so that those great conversations driven by the OKRs down at that next level down can say, well, this is a little bit about the how behind that what, that, you know, we understand now a lot better. And we're confident that if we come up with some great objectives to chase next quarter, the money will be there for us.
Yeah. So, and really quick, because I think actually this aligns really well with what we're talking about here. We're mentioning OKRs, which could throw me off a whole rabbit hole. So, but there's a question in the chat. So it's, I'm curious what the panel thinks of deliberately keeping resources, so money and people, more organic and tight for, say, Horizon 3 stuff versus heavy investment to foster being lean before bringing it into nearer horizons as it kind of gains traction. And so, you know, for example, Google's 20% concept. Let's start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it makes sense. I mean, I think that the McKinsey 3 Horizon model has tried to back into essentially the 3X model. It's just that they use time frame to talk about uncertainty of whether something is valuable or not. And so I think I see there being similarities, at least, between those things, or at least they rhyme in some way. And so, yes, I do think we should potentially put less resources, but on a lot of different bets. I mean, different companies do it differently as well. Like at Microsoft, because of the fact that it was, you know, making lots of money, it could fund different teams to do the same thing, basically, or go after the same problem. And so that's a way to bet on, like, one of these teams is going to create the best solution for this problem, essentially. It means they'll have to kill or like reallocate the other teams at some point. But that is like a portfolio management thing around this type of problem. Google does have the 20% problems, and there's some stuff that's come out of that, definitely. I think the idea of passion projects creating something valuable for the business, though, I don't know. I would want to see more like information about whether that actually happens, because the thing, when I was working at a company called Philosophy, which was like a small design consultancy, we would try to help, you know, innovation labs within organizations build new things. And the biggest issue was that because innovation was split out from this idea of like the real work that needs to get done, it meant that continuity from these like innovation teams into the rest of the product was usually not happening. And so I just think there's something interesting about, we should be making innovation as part of our like playbook within every team. We should be always trying to look at how we will be in some way, taken off course based on the fact that a competitor will come around and then do something that's surprising. And so I think that's something that's very, very hard to do, but we need to make sure that we're doing all of those projects inside of a team. Because I think also, like, not everybody just wants to do like the regular bugs that need to have like a specialized SLO because there's a customer that needs it. Like, they don't want to just do that type of support teamwork all the time. People want to rotate around. They want to work on different things. And so I think like thinking about also like, how does your portfolio impact the team that you're trying to now like portfolio manage is really, really important, I think. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the guidance I've seen, and I can't say I've lived through this directly lately, is Horizon 3 is more on that venture model, right? So you want to make sure that there is money available, but these are the bets, and you're letting people have a lot of autonomy to go prove out, this thing's got legs. But it's still small at that point. So where portfolio management would come in is you've got something successful in Horizon 3, and now you're trying to turn into something Horizon 2 to Horizon 1. That extra bit of money to help it scale, that's not going to happen organically, right? That is going to require an asymmetric bet, some shifts coming out of portfolio leaders to say, this is we're going to turn this particular thing in Horizon 3 into a core part of our business now, and to do that, here's the assistance in terms of funding we're going to provide.
Yeah, John, can you talk a bit just kind of about like managing that cone of uncertainty and just kind of models for kind of making, both those kind of like pivot, persevere decisions on like the status quo kind of, big, slow moving kind of huge investments, right? Versus protecting some of these, kind of like early high signal investments. Like what does that look like in a portfolio?
Yeah, I've just been rereading some Jeffrey Moore, so that's probably influencing my answer here. But I think that solution to the innovator's dilemma of making sure you can isolate your Horizon 3 work, following more of a venture model from, the businesses that are bringing in the majority of your revenues, right? I think, and then knowing how you can start moving, one from the other. That the whole Horizon model is recognizing that some of your Horizon 1 things that are bringing all the revenues right now, they won't be there in the future. So what are you going to do to fill that gap? And that's really what we're talking about here. So the deliberate way to bring new things to life in Horizon 3, make great portfolio management decisions to shepherd them on their way to Horizon 1. That's another great way to think of the scale that we're talking about here, potentially either within a line of business, because this occurs within a business as well, or at the grandest scale, in a Fortune 100 company at the C-suite level.
Well, and also the whole idea of essentially that you can make these types of adjustments very easily. I think it's very hard because unless you're doing something like the idea of like zero-based accounting and stuff like that, trying to like reassess all projects every year, for example, I think you do get into a weird place where those like cash cows will be trying to steal or keep the money that they're getting in comparison to like the rising stars, if you wanted to use that type of terminology. This is why I think like making those teams be more part of the actual like innovation, I think is valuable, because then you worry less about like taking money from one and doing that type of thing. But I do think it's very hard for us to like innovate yourself out of the business. It's something that requires like usually major crises to actually cause you to do something. And that could be the idea of like a tripwire or a major event that causes you to now rethink, and you have like a senior leader that is willing to put their bets down on this type of thing. But this is also why we do reorgs, right? Like Conway's law is that we ship our org chart. And so a lot of the time we end up doing reorgs is because we actually want the organization to work in a different way. And I don't know, that's one pathway that I've seen, that if you want to have like major change in how you actually fund projects, is you just have a reorg. And it's kind of a fake crisis, because you can decide to do a reorg in any way you want for whatever reason as like a senior leader. You need to have good reasoning when you're like describing it, but that basically is a fake crisis that you're creating to reorganize your team into some new way. So
I've never seen a reorg successfully drive change, but I have seen it slow calcification, and I think that at the end of the day is kind of all you're going to get out of that. But yeah, I think. I lost my train of thought on that. There was something. What were we just talking about a second ago, Kyle?
Oh, we're talking about just kind of pivot, persevere decisions, or?
Yeah, I think we covered that ground. I know what it was. We were talking about how difficult it is when one team kind of sees, hey, that's my money. I've been moving in this direction. But I think that is a key part of portfolio management as well, is it's you're trying to appeal to kind of that higher level strategy. What do we need? You've been going laser focused, right, on what you're doing, and you believe in it, as you should. But portfolio management is a chance to sit back and say, how can we look across cross-functional, different parts of the organization, different products even, and say, what are the difficult trade-offs we have to make through funding, where somebody's going to come out unhappy. And I think that's where the dissent comes in. And this is also why it's so hard to budge off the status quo. If you're doing portfolio management right, you're probably pissing people off. And that's difficult for all of us as humans, right?
Well, yeah, and like what percentage of people actually have to agree to the new portfolio? Well, it's just the leader actually. And so I think there's something interesting about like inside Google, we're a very consensus driven culture. And so I think getting the getting the reps in to be able to disagree and have, make your case, and then a decider or decision maker should ideally be one person, right? And I think that's where like who is the decider within this portfolio is something we may not always like define, and it may be considered that we're all going to just like work this out together, when the reality is like for those types of trade-offs where it's going to be hard to make the trade-off, there is a single decision maker, and it's usually the leader of that team.
But also,
yeah.
Yeah, well, but great strategic communication using things like even overstatements help minimize how much people are pissed off, right? If you can quickly understand the why behind this and it's been well communicated, then you start to avoid some of the problems that lead to a real lack of understanding of how the organization is navigating uncertainty.
Well, and that's, I think, the problem when you don't have this kind of like very clear, concise version of a strategy or even overstatements or any of these types of things available to your team, is that you can't say this is how we made this decision. It ends up being like, we just all got in a room and argued for 3 hours and then we came out with this list, right? Like that's not a helpful way to do it. But if you can now say, well, here's the principles by which we'll make these decisions, or here's the tenets, or here's the even overstatements by which we'll make these decisions going forward, and here's how we did that inside this meeting, like I 100% agree with you. That makes it much easier, because then people would be like, oh, well, it's actually the times that are going to be most interesting then are when these like even overstatements or tenets end up being in kind of conflict with each other, because then you need to have that type of discussion with your senior leaders, and it may mean that you have to start stack ranking even your tenets in some way. But I think that's when you need to have now the next conversation, and it's okay though too, because it's not a bad thing that our strategies are complex and they deal with different environments in different ways. The thing is important is that we actually end up like having the right conversations, but try to avoid a lot of that stuff where we don't want to like constantly relitigate. Like it's also the difference between like charter and strategy, is that you should ideally be having more frequent conversations about your strategy and less frequent conversations about your charter. If you're constantly going back to should this team exist, you're in a bad place as far as like a team discussion and everything like that. You want to be just in the like our discussion around strategy rather than the discussion of should this team exist is another thing I would argue.
Yeah, as I lose power. So really quick, and I think what's interesting about just talking about disagreement, like I think that's interesting, especially with the Uncertainty project. That's something that we're diving into. As we wrap this up, as the dog goes wild, what's kind of closing remark? If I'm operating a portfolio, what's kind of the first thing I should focus on?
Well, I think you're in this connecting space here, right? You're trying to decentralize the decision making, get these teams to be autonomous, independent, but yet also very aware of the strategy and all these trade-offs we keep coming back to. So, as a portfolio manager, you've got a tremendous power with great responsibility, as they say. So put the money where it needs to be. Don't be afraid of asymmetric bets to really turn the battleship when you need to. And that's easy to say, very hard to do.
I would just add to this that it's really, really important that you create the right kind of spaces and containers to have these conversations. Because if you're that idea of understanding the reason why trade-offs are being made and how they're being made, it's not just for the alignment of the team that's going to like be talking about those trade-offs, but it's also now for the rest of the team. And so I think finding those right times and places to have those types of discussions is really important. And then I think actually highlighting the controversies inside the teams end up like pushing you towards creating more clear and concise strategic information as well, which I think the portfolio should absolutely be as like aligned with as possible. And so I think like that type of like controversy discussion is really, really important to have.
Awesome. Well, hey, huge thanks to both of y'all for taking the time today. This was awesome. What we'll do is we'll have a link to this as well. This will just go out to the full email list. Thanks a ton for everybody that took time out of their day to sit in on this conversation with us and for the questions. And yeah, you'll get you'll hear from the Uncertainty Project about what's next. So thank you all again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the great conversation.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Chris.